Good day, people. This is Ernest Becker's Culture, Capitalistic Guilt, and Expiation from his book Beyond Alienation, a Philosophy of Education for the Crisis of Democracy. And so, culture, capitalistic guilt, and expiation carries on this theme about money that we've been discussing. And I think, in a way, Becker introduces a sort of Marxian twist, which is interesting. How many sacrifices would be necessary for the primitives? Becker says this. He says, among the primitives, one sacrifice would be enough to signal victory. One tortured prisoner would appease the gods. One life would sanctify a season, purify a whole tribe. Conviction, in a word, came easily and cheaply because all activities were an organic relationship, each being ramified in all areas: war and God, ritual and myth, song and art, imagination and reason, all formed one complex whole. And so what he's talking about here is in ancient culture, the sacrifice would only be required of one. Whereas make this case that like our present lifestyle, right? This kind of industrial first world grinding of the kind of earth for its resources, if it has a much greater degree of sacrifice, right? I mean, we sacrifice like the sacrifice of the people who are like quasi-slave labor in third world countries, the sacrifice for the environment, the debt and stuff for future generations. He's kind of comparing the like the simpler ancient culture to kind of modernity, which our sacrifices are in the thousands, if not millions, especially if we consider war as sacrifice. What are the terms of justification for the bureaucratic method? Becker says this. He says, the bureaucratic method, on the other hand, has a separate life of its own and must justify itself on its terms, and these terms are abstraction and number. So we understand that when we combine the awe-inspiring finality of flesh and blood with the abstraction of rational calculation, the toll of evil must be high. The bureaucratic God is the bureaucracy itself, and this God, unlike that of the primitive, is unappeasable. And what Becker is kind of like attacking here is these sort of mass bureaucracies, that in a way it's very challenging to kind of articulate this one, but I'm going to give it a shot. It's like with this idea of abstraction and number, we can in a way rationalize from the bureaucratic perspective uh, doing things that are highly immoral and unethical, right? And here, let me give you an example, right? We don't even have to take war, which is really what he's talking about. I mean, think about like uh, the the British petroleum oil spill, right? Because of I think it was the Horizon, the right there. I don't know if you've ever seen. I think Mark Wahlberg starred in the film, and it's very interesting because the reason that the oil rig in the Gulf, right, the southern Gulf of what is it down there, like the right kind of down there by Louisiana and by our southern shores, the horizon sort of exploded and created this natural disaster. But the reason for it was neglect on the part of British Petroleum, because they were doing these calculations of abstraction and number that had to do with like risk, and I mean if there was an accident, to what extent would they be like financially exposed, and what that led to is a series of bureaucratic decisions that created this natural disaster. What was the war cry of Marxist critique of capitalism? So here's where we start talking about Marx. So this is what Becker says. Marx's great critique of the social fiction of capitalism was launched under the war cry of the fetishism of commodities. It was a brilliant and telling criticism of the new game of commercial industrial society. It meant that man was now narrowing his meanings down to the smallest area of satisfaction, to the area of consumer goods. And so here's like this consumptive criticism at its most direct level that, um, the fetishism of commodities that Marx talked about, sort of meant that, of all the possibility of being human, right? All the incredible creativity that we possess, that we would narrow, right? That's what a fetish is. It kind of narrows the others, I don't know, like possibilities down to one unique, only one thing. So the fetishism of commodities is the critique that says that, people are very narrow in the sense that all they want to do is buy and sell and ignore their kind of greater development and further creativities. Why is this a vicious fetishism? Becker asserts it was indeed a fetishism of the most vicious kind, a fetishism in which man's striving for freedom, dignity, unlimited scope, the largest possible panorama of meanings, all this was sacrificed to a singly buy and sell fetishism, right? So if it narrow the person down to only, being like a shopaholic or something, uh, this is kind of like the extreme vicious fetishism of commodities that Marx is talking about, I guess. In the 20th century, man's sharpest mental skill is to do what? Well, this is Becker's assertion. It was absurd and humanly debasing, but it went ahead full steam until in the 20th century, man's sharpest mental skill was the quick recall of brand names, the unflinching decision between rival products. Right? That's pretty, it's pretty narrowing and confining. What are bad aesthetics? Becker asserts this. He says, bad aesthetics then would be that which the individual undertakes under the old authority, under the coercion of the old rules for behavior that he learned as a child. This would be the coercion of fear of making new and independent choices, unexpected ones, choices more appropriate to new situations, hence choices that would take the individual out of his old world and continually renew the possibility of developing the life force. It's very sort of interesting, especially when you frame it in terms of like a cultural background. It's like, so for him, like bad aesthetics are limiting and constraining because they're just kind of doing what one learned as a child and repeating it, and that doesn't allow for growth and cultivation and development. I mean, for Becker, bad aesthetics then kind of prevent spontaneous, um, art, art, what artful strategies of developing the self. So, if bad aesthetics are constraining, then good aesthetics lead to growth and development. So, this is what Becker says. He says, good aesthetics then are the choices that are not bound rigidly by the early learning, the ones that are not limited by automatic perceptions, the ones that are not a reflex of childhood conditioning. Good aesthetics are those which the individual undertakes under the aegis of his own responsible powers, out of his narrow familiar world. The thing that makes one aesthetic pattern broader and richer would simply be that it releases more of the life force in the aesthetic integration. Why is scapegoating a kind of social stupidity, right? And so scapegoating is, I mean, it's very interesting. It's that, we look to our friend Kenneth Burke because he wrote really extensively on this. So the idea of scapegoating is that in society there's a lot of kind of fear and anxiety, from like social guilt, and we've got to do something with it, and we can mortify, and that would be like wearing the guilt on our own shoulders. So doing works of good or something like that, or really trying hard for social change. That and that in no way expiates the guilt, but I think one of the more common ways of expiating or releasing social guilt is scapegoating and victimage. If you feel bad about something, one can always blame someone else for the cause of that problem. I mean, we really see this in terms of like immigration and, kind of relations with foreign countries, and I think the whole idea in a way of racism, and kind of hatred of other religions, xenophobia, functions via the scapegoating phenomena. So it's, I mean, very important and fascinating. So why is scapegoating a kind of social stupidity? Becker asserts we can understand other types of social stupidity with a richness that has not before been possible. Scapegoating, for example, is, as we saw, a clumsy and easy way to achieve the unity of one's own group, to reaffirm one's own values and meanings, to exercise firm control over one's social world by offering up the sacrifice of the evil stranger.